Hey everyone, thank you all for coming. It's been a long and nice conference with lots of nice talks, but now we are reaching the end. So I'm going to talk a bit about Tokio and, open source. So who am I? My name is Alice, and I am a core maintainer of Tokio, which is an asynchronous runtime. So those of you who have used async Rust, you've probably used Tokio. That's a pretty good chance. I also do some other stuff. I work on Rust in the Linux kernel, on the Android Rust team at Google. So yeah, all this awesome stuff. But I want to start off by telling you a bit about how did I get into open source? How did I get into Tokio? And for me, it really all started with, I was helping people on this forum. We have it's the official users Rust forum. I spent a lot of time there helping people with their Rust questions, all sorts of different things. I realized that I was helping a lot of, there were a lot of Tokio questions every so often. At some point, I joined the Tokio Discord and started helping people there. So I was helping all of these people. I saw what they found to be confusing. And so my first PRs to Tokio, they were doc changes. Yeah, and so when I started, what I really cared about was, this documentation, or these users, what if they had a nice experience? And so this is my first PR that's not a doc change. Even this one was, some users asked me, oh, I have this hyper stream of bytes, and I want an async read. How do I do that? And my answer was, it's kind of difficult. But no longer, because I added a utility to do that. So even when I started, submitting features, it was still motivated by the same idea. This idea is that I talked to users, and we improved things to make their life easier. So one thing I really like is this idea that when you've seen a question a few times, maybe you should do something about it. So one example of this is my first successful blog post, this what is blocking? This was a question I got a lot of times. And every time I had to answer it, it was like, oh, it's a long story. And so I wrote a blog post. Now my answer is not so long anymore. It's just a link. If you haven't read it, you should check it out. The takeaway is that async code should not spend a long time without reaching an await. Other documentation things we've done, feature flags. Tokio is, it's one crate. It used to be many crates, but now it's one crate. But we still have feature flags, so you only have to compile the things you need. But sometimes, if you're trying to use something you haven't enabled, you just get an error saying, oh, this thing doesn't exist. I think the error is better today, actually. But still, we added these special markers to the documentation saying, oh, if you want to use this, you need this feature. And this is a small thing, right? But I think it really makes a big difference, all of these small things. Another thing we documented, select is kind of a long story, but one problem we had with it was the features you use it have to be cancellation safe. And so I went through every single Tokio function and documented whether it's cancel safe. Then, we put together a tutorial. This wasn't just me, it was also Carl. But we put together a tutorial, and this was actually back when we were releasing Tokio 1.0. We wanted to make a crate that people could rely on, people had good documentation, and some amount of stability so that the entire ecosystem doesn't have to go update every time we make a breaking change. That's not so nice. So this is from the blog post that announced 1.0. And so we wanted to say, we're going to promise not to do a 2.0 for some amount of years. And we still have no plans to do that. If it stands to me, then we will never do that. And I thought it was kind of funny that Nico, at the opening keynote, was talking about stability without stagnation. If you read the last line, the stability does not mean that Tokio will stagnate. We still have a lot of work to do. So that's also something we care about. Now, so we released Tokio 1.0 on December 23rd, 2020. And then 2 days later, we get this issue saying, hey, your read-write log, it actually has a soundness issue. There's some unsafe code in there that's wrong, so my safe code causes memory unsafety. And we thought, damn, we just promised not to do breaking changes for several years. But sometimes you have to be pragmatic. We said, okay, people have only used this for 2 days. If anybody has started using this yet, they probably have it fresh enough in their mind that they can, go change their sync code. And we removed the problematic piece, and then we had Tokio 1.0.1 with a breaking change. And I think this is kind of interesting, right? Because, projects say, we're not going to do breaking changes unless it's, a major version bump. But, sometimes you do something that's technically a breaking change, but, not all changes are equally breaking. Right? This was an API change. We removed something from the API. Still, it was OK. Now, we tried this another time. So this wasn't even an API change. We were just changing the behavior of one of the APIs. Right? So it's kind of, is this a breaking change or not? Well, it's not always so clear. But in this case, it turns out it was, because, I guess you can call it the scream test, right? Because we don't have telemetry. Like if you run Tokio, it's not phoning home to tell us what you use. So in some way, the only way for us to know whether somebody is using something or relying on something is the scream test. Right? We tried this out. People screamed. We reverted it. So sometimes breaking changes are breaking. But anyways, so I think this is kind of interesting that things are a bit more fluid than you think. And this kind of thing about what do you promise? Like, I think there are a lot of interesting things you could talk about. Minimum supported Rust versions. Tokio has like long-term support releases, but I'm not going to talk about that. One thing is, when you submit a PR to Tokio, do I have to take the PR? Obviously not. But, we still have to be nice to each other, right? And so, for example, if it's a change that we are never going to accept because it's the wrong direction, then we should actually think about that when we get the PR, and then close it then. We shouldn't go through 20 rounds of review and then figure out we don't want this and then close it, right? Because then we wasted your time. One thing you will often see in open source projects is that before you submit a PR, if it's something you spend a lot of time on, you should probably talk to us first, right, before you spend the time. And that's because of this kind of thing. I don't like closing PRs. I like merging them. Yeah, I think this is really important. Maybe there are some of you out there that want to get involved with open source. I have a few thoughts on this. I know other talks have had thoughts on this as well, but let's say you wanted to get involved. Well, pick some project you're interested in. I'm talking about Tokio, but there are others out there. I think most people start by submitting PRs. You can do that with issues, or if you have something you care about yourself. We sometimes, it's not that rare for us to get PRs that there's no issue for. I think that works too. And one thing that many new contributors are worried about is this thing about knowing everything. And that's really not necessary, I think. Because generally, code bases that are well designed will be modular. Right? We have a message passing channel. Then there's the runtime internals. Then there's the I/O resources. These are somewhat separate. And of course, there's some relation between them. But you can actually make changes to, and people do, make changes to these things without knowing the rest of the stuff. And so I think it's important to realize that you can just pick one little corner and start looking at that. Like my documentation corner when I started. Another interesting thing is this question of, who can merge PRs? And I think that, if you become involved with a project, then in some sense you want to get to a point where you can actually merge PRs. Then, that means that's pretty cool. And I think that people overestimate how difficult it is to get to that point. They think that, if we give that out to someone who has submitted only 10 PRs for a few months, then, then we're making a compromise on quality or something like that. But I don't think we are. I think that with the way we do things, we can actually, we have checks and so on to make sure that you can actually have new contributors who can merge stuff without it being a compromise of quality. So there are several reasons for this. One is that new contributors, they want to do things right. And so they're usually the strictest reviewers we have. And they rarely merge anything non-trivial, I find, without talking it over with somebody more experienced. That's one aspect of it. Another thing is that just because a new contributor clicks the merge button, that doesn't mean that nobody else will see the PR. I mean, if I see it, I will, take a quick look at the source code to make sure that it's reasonable. And if there's some problem, then we can have a follow-up PR and fix it. Right? Merging a PR is not the same as making a release. And it's only when we make a release that there's any sort of promise of backwards compatibility. And even then, let's say it gets merged, and the people who do a quick check don't notice any problems. Well, there's another check. When we actually make a release, the way we do it is, we go into the repository, we look over the log, say, oh, we made all these changes. And in Tokio, we actually put together the change log by hand. And then we have this PR with all these changes. And then there will be a core contributor that looks at the changelog and says, is there anything unreasonable here? And there have been instances where I merge something, and then when I submit the changelog for the release, Carl is like, actually, I prefer we didn't do that. That has happened. And so then we reverted it, and so this is another quality check. And maybe it looks okay. Then you get somebody approve your changes, and then you can merge it. Yeah, I was really hoping the Wi-Fi worked. Anyways, one contribution you can make if you're a contributor is, you can submit PRs, but there's other stuff too, right? If you submit a PR, some maintainer will have to spend some time on reviewing that. And there's actually a lot of reviewing to do. In 2023, we had 520 PRs. That's almost 2 per day on average. If you look at my GitHub Compass, you can see it over here. The majority of what I do is code review. And so when we get contributors that help with reviews, well, that actually reduces the amount of reviews that other maintainers have to do. And so in this way, it's kind of a unique kind of contribution that you can make. I think reviews, like helping with that, is kind of overlooked. It's kind of boring and so on, but at least in my case, it's something I really appreciate. Another thing, I told you about that when I got into Tokio, I just had the thing I cared about. I cared about improving the documentation. And I think this is actually, this goes back to what I said in the earlier slide about knowing everything. I don't think you ever need to know everything to be a valued contributor. I actually find that if I look back at the contributors who have joined, some of them stay around for some months and then go away again, and that's of course fine. But some of them stay around. And I find that the ones that really stay around, they have some specific thing they care about. In my case, it was documentation. There's been another maintainer who cares about observability. We also have someone who knows about the process and signal stuff, and every time we have a pull request to those part of Tokio, we bring him in, but otherwise, he's not really involved. But he has been around for years. And so I think this is good to realize that not only don't you need to know everything, in my experience, the people who stay around, they don't even try to know everything, in my experience. It took many years until I started to know, at this point, I probably know almost everything in the main Tokio repository. But even in my case, Tokio is a large project. We have Mayo, Axum, Tracing, Tonic, a long list of projects, bytes. I don't know anything. I don't know all of them. There are some of them where I have never looked at the source code. And so yeah, I think you really have to think about, you really, really don't have to know everything. Yeah. Yeah, and so I want to thank all of the people who use Tokio, all of the people who contribute, all of our sponsors, and all of the people who download Tokio. In 2023, we reached 100 million downloads. I think that's really awesome. So yeah, thank you, everyone.